Hello, my name is Jack Garner, and this is my defense for my syllabus part 1 and 2 for History 641. Um, I primarily, when studying history, I primarily focus on the social aspect, people's experiences throughout those historical events and historical time periods, and so that'll be reflected in my syllabus and in my course. So starting out, my required reading will be the Foner books for part 1 and 2. And then in part 1, I'll have them read Founding Brothers by Joseph Ellis. It talks a lot about the relationships among the founding fathers and how that shaped the early republic, and we'll talk about that in that section, or we'll read that in that section. Then in the second part, in my second course of American history, I'll have them read excerpts from Freedom of Fear by David Kennedy. I read this in my undergraduate, and it really focuses on, has a lot of good excerpts and chapters about the lives of Americans during the Depression and World War II. So getting right into my syllabus, I'm going to have them read obviously these books, but then I'm going to talk about a lot of the social aspects of these time periods. For instance, in week 1, we're going to talk about the first American migrants, but not only the first the first migrants, but also we're going to talk about the Europeans and also the people, the natives that were already there before they got there, focusing on their cultures and how their lives looked. And then week 2, we're going to look at colonization. We're going to look at the English, Dutch, Spanish, and French perspectives of those. I'm going to have them look at religion and how that played a huge role. I myself, being a social historian, I look a lot at religion and how it shapes people's lives. Have them focus on that as well. Then in week 3, we're going to talk about England's North American Empire and how the colonies were shaped, and we'll talk about that also in week 4 when we discuss slavery and religion, and so how those American colonies looked under British occupation, how they differed from one another, how the lives of African Americans and women differed in the South than it did in the North, looking at how their religion affects the way they establish their towns and how they run their towns, how they orchestrate their lives among each other. And then in week 5, we're going to look at the colonial tensions rising between the English or the British and also the Americans, looking not only at the obvious, the taxes and the Boston Tea Party and stuff, but we're also going to look at a lot of the circumstances that those early Americans were in that would cause them to become, stifled by excessive taxing. Then in week 6, we talk about how America, it was characterized by economics, religion, democracy, how slavery was shaped, women in America, their interaction, even from the beginning to this point, how Americans have interacted with natives. Then in week 7, we're going to talk about after the Revolution from 1783 to 1791. We're going to discuss the American government under the Articles of Confederation, and then look at the Constitution, and not only just the forming of the Constitution, but also we're going to look at how the Constitution is reflected in American citizens' lives. And so taking that political aspect and reorienting it into the social aspect of people's lives, their rights that are protected in the Constitution, and those rights that are that are in the Bill of Rights. Then in week 8, we will discuss from 1791 to 1815. We'll discuss the Jefferson presidency, the War of 1812, but also not just to look at those aspects. We're going to look at Thomas Jefferson, his persona. We're going to look at soldiers during the War of 1812, also back on the home front and how that looked for American citizens. Week 9, we'll discuss how economics had evolved from early America all the way up until about 1840, looking at the market revolution, the workers' experiences in the American economy. the impact of slavery and so on. Then week 10, we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson, his economic plans, their interaction with the Native Americans, especially, his presidency, the bank war. But really, we're going to primarily focus on what life was like in America at the time. Then we'll discuss in week 11 slavery, and not just looking at the institution of slavery, but the lives of slaves, their cultures, what they had brought with them, what they didn't, how they interacted with one another. Then we're going to talk about in 1820 to 1840 in week 12, we're going to talk about the abolition growing in America. We're also going to look at feminism and so on and so forth, that move towards that type of reform. Week 13, talk about expansion in the West from 1840 to 1861. We're going to look at the lives of those that went west. Week 14, we're going to look at the Civil War, obviously, like some of the battles and stuff, but also we're going to look at the lives of soldiers, the life of Lincoln, emancipation, how that affected the slaves, and what their situation was going to be like afterwards. And then in the final week, we're going to discuss post-Civil War, just briefly leading up into the second course. The second course, it's also divided into weeks at a time. So starting out there, we'll start with Reconstruction. So we'll briefly cover just the the Emancipation Proclamation, into the Civil War, and then we'll discuss how the outcome of the Civil War led into the Reconstruction, how the lives of African Americans were affected by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. What does the women's role look like? Does that change at all? Then in week 2, from 1870 to 1890, we're going to talk about the Gilded Age. We're going to talk about really American labor. That's one thing I'd like to focus on a lot because it has to do a lot with those people's lives. In the Gilded Age, talking about the rise in, maybe we need more workers' representation and so on. Then in week 3, we'll talk about populism, segregation, and imperialism. Those black codes, lynching, Jim Crow laws, and so on, and how their experience was, but also because of the workers, for instance, in the Gilded Age, how they're moving more towards a demand for some kind of reform. So we'll discuss a lot of their experiences. Then we'll talk about. After week 3, we'll talk about in week 4 the progressive era from 1900 to about 1916. Talk about the presidents like Teddy and how their policies affected the workers in America. Week 5, we'll talk about World War I and right after. So the idea of isolationism and the American public, American government really just keeping to itself, and then how America moves onto the world stage as a result of the Great War. Look at wartime economics, things like victory gardens and how people interacted with the war and what their lives looked like. And then in the week 6, we'll look at the 1920s and leading up to the Depression, the lives of those such as women, like flappers and things like that. We'll also discuss the stock market, but really we'll discuss primarily the situation of workers and really just everybody in the American society in the 1920s leading up to the Great Depression, what they're about to lose. The week 7 we'll discuss the Great Depression and New Deal, looking at how government programs affect people like farmers, and so on, the slums that those American citizens had been working in. Then we'll, in week 8, talk about World War II, the home front. We'll talk a lot about that, how the workers on the home front affected the outcome of the war. We'll talk about in week 9 the end of the war, but leading up to that, we'll talk about Japanese internment camps. Week 10, the Cold War, the Red Scare, how that affected American citizens. Week 11, 1960s, the peace movements, civil rights, and then in week 12, the 70s, the culture, the music, the women's movement, the feminist movement. Week 12, we'll talk about the wars, the draft, and so on and so forth, and how that affected them. and then we'll move into Bill Clinton's presidency, Desert Storm, and technology, and how technology shapes American society. And then lastly, we will discuss 9/11 and the War on Terror, and how that's shaped American society as a whole. Thanks.